How to change the front brake pads and rotors on a 2016 to 2023 Toyota Tacoma. This is a V6 four-wheel drive with the dual piston setup. Let's open the reservoir for the brake fluid. So when you compress the caliper, the fluid has somewhere to escape to. I've never had an issue to where a seal has blown out if I didn't remove the cap, but you never know. It's always best to remove the cap, just leave it right there so no dust falls in. Now jack up the vehicle. You can see I use the jack and I position the jack in a position where I give myself enough room to place the jack stand. I like to jack up both front wheels of the vehicle when I do my brake job, so it's easier to move the wheel around if I need to. Now with the vehicle jacked up and properly supported, we're going to go ahead and remove the front wheel. Hopefully you know how to do this. If this part is hard for you, I might proceed with caution when doing my own brake job. You might want to take it and get it done. If you took this to a shop, you'd probably end up paying around $300 to get this job done. Maybe a little bit more, give or take, but that would be a rough estimate at a shop. Let's position the rotor to where it's easier to work on. I'm going to turn the wheels to the passenger side. This will make it easier to access the rotor, caliper, everything. So here we are, caliper. We're going to take these slider pins out first. So first we need to remove the retaining spring that holds or locks the slider pins in place. The slider pins are what the actual pads slide on and off of. And this little spring, I'm using a pair of needle nose pliers, just pops right out. Take a little bit of caution. If you buy a hardware set or get a hardware set with your pads, they should come with these new springs as well. So now you have the spring off the pin removed. Now let's remove both pins, the bottom. I'm going to use the bottom pin to help push out the top pin, and make sure you keep or remember the location of where you took these pins out. You always want to try to put the bottom pin back in the bottom pin, and same with the top. So set those off to the side, somewhere where you're not going to lose them or get them mixed up. Now we're going to remove the other spring. This little spring on the bottom helps push the pads off of the rotor when you depress the brake pedal. So instead of the pads just staying stuck on the brake rotor itself, when you let go of the brake pad, the spring should help push them off of the rotor so you don't get any rubbage or your brakes deteriorate a lot faster. So that's why I like to put new springs on if I can, if I'm actually doing a brake replacement. So get all these springs off. Now with all the springs off, your brake pad should slide right out of the caliper. Just pull directly up. If you're having any problems sliding the pads out of the caliper, get a small screwdriver, or you can see I also use the slider pin to help pry the pad up on the outboard side. But any way it takes to get them out, go ahead and get them out, because you're going to replace these when it's all said and done. So really, you already have the brake pads out of the caliper. This is pretty quick. We're only a couple minutes into the job, and we're more than halfway there. Now with the brake pads out, we need to compress the caliper. This is why we removed the cap on the reservoir to begin with, or before we started this job. So when we compress these pistons back into the caliper, the fluid has somewhere to go. You might get some leakage out of the reservoir itself onto the floor, so you might want to put down a mat or something to absorb that brake fluid if it does come out. After you get all said and done with this brake job, you're going to top this off as well, but you want to relieve the pressure if you can so you don't blow out any seals. So now push the pistons back into the caliper. You want to compress it as far as you can. You can see I'm using a dual piston caliper compressor. You'll find a link in the description below to purchase one of these if you need one. And there's a couple links, or there should be a link for a next day delivery as well. So make sure you check that out. You might be able to rig up a couple of pry bars or maybe some flathead screwdrivers to do this, but I would highly recommend you get the caliper compressor like I'm using in this video. It speeds up the process by a lot. Press the pistons all the way back into the caliper. Now let's go ahead and get the bolts loosened up on the caliper to the spindle. Using a 17mm deep socket in this situation, I prefer a 6-point socket, and as well I'm using a 1/2-inch breaker bar. I'm going to loosen up the bottom and the top bolt. Make sure everything is loose before we move on. I'm not going to remove this just yet. So get these two bolts loosened up. Now we're going to move on to the little bracket right here on the spindle arm that goes up to the control arm. And here we're going to find a bracket that holds the brake hose and also a brake ABS sensor line or sensor wire. I'd prefer to remove both of these, so separate them. I ended up doing that later on in the video. So a 12mm 6-point socket is what it's going to take to remove the actual bracket from the spindle. And then it's going to be a 10mm 6-point socket to remove the bracket for the ABS sensor. I would just remove both of those now, or separate them now. Set the bolts off to the side. Make sure you don't lose them so it speeds up the process when reassembling everything. Now we got the bracket off. Everything is nice and loose. Nothing's gonna get caught when we take everything apart. Let's remove the caliper off of the rotor itself. Get something to support the caliper to hang it up on your shock or your spring right here. You don't want this to dangle down. Again, you don't want to bend that S-shaped hardened brake line, and you just don't want to put any stress on the brake line for any brake job. So get something to support it up here on the spring. Now with the caliper supported on the spring, not just hanging there, they actually make some S-hooks that you'll find links in the description below that are meant for this. So you hook them onto the caliper and then it hooks onto the spring and it just sits there. They're pretty cool. I just discovered them, or somebody just showed them to me in the last week or so. So I will be using them on brake jobs moving forward. Check them out. Now, let's get the rotor off. The rotor, I tried to hit it with the hammer a couple times, knock it off, but we're doing this brake job, or we're taking these brakes off to see if we could find the source of a squeaking noise. I think I already found it in the beginning process of doing this video, but we're gonna keep going so you guys can see what it takes to remove the brake pads and rotors and get this brake job done yourself in your driveway at home and save a couple bucks. Now, if a hammer doesn't work to get this rotor off, you might need to find some 8mm by 125 thread pitch bolts. You could pick these up at your local hardware store, or you might find a link in the description for these as well. But these are what it's going to take to pry the rotor off of the hub. You don't want to whack it too hard because you don't want to ruin the bearings in the hub assembly. I've never had that issue, but hey, I don't want somebody to come back and say, you told me to whack it hard and this is what happened. So use these bolts, 8mm by 125 thread pitch, tighten them on to the hub assembly and the rotor should pop off. You can see this rotor came off fairly easy. I only needed to use my hands, or it was a hand tight type of bolt that took the pressure to get the rotor off of the hub assembly, and that was it. So we're completely halfway done now with this brake job. That's removing the brake pads, removing the caliper, removing the rotor, and let's get ready for reassembly. So on part 2 of this video, or part 2 of this series, you will find the reinstallation process. I will be going over more tips, showing you the tools that it's going to take, showing you the tools that it takes to get everything put back together, and I'm also going to be going over proper torque specs on this vehicle as well. So make sure you like, subscribe, and share. Check out my other videos, and part 2 will be coming out very soon if it's not out already. Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. I'll see you on the next, hopefully helpful video.